U.S. intelligence community expects the reduced tempo in fighting in Ukraine to continue in coming months. According to the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, while the conflict has wound down to an extent, the U.S. expects both Ukraine and Russia to prepare for counteroffensives in the spring. Take a listen to her analysis while speaking at the annual Reagan National Defense Forum in California on Saturday.
Yeah, I think, so as we're looking at the trajectory of the conflict kind of going through the next several months, honestly, we're seeing a kind of a reduced tempo already of the conflict. Most of the fighting right now is around Bakhmut and the Donetsk area, and sort of has slowed down with the withdrawal of Russia from the sort of western Kherson area to the east of the river. And we expect that's likely to be what we see in the coming months. And then once you get past the winter, the sort of question is, what will the counteroffensive look like potentially in the spring, in effect in March and in that area? And we expect that, frankly, both militaries are going to be in a situation where they're going to be looking to try to refit, resupply, in a sense, reconstitute so that they're kind of prepared for that counteroffensive. But we actually have a fair amount of skepticism as to whether or not the Russians will be, in fact, prepared to do that. And I think, yeah, more optimistically for the Ukrainians in that time frame.
And joining me in studio now is Senior International Affairs Correspondent Owen Alterman. Owen, thank you for joining me. Owen, break down Haines' analysis for us.
Well, I mean, 2 points. First of all, Sarah, there's an inherent conflict of interest in the Director of National Intelligence going on there and giving a kind of impartial commentary. On one hand, she's wearing the hat of the intelligence officer, right, whose job is to speak truth, to give an unbiased and an analysis that is not tainted by her own feelings, that's giving the actual picture of the situation so that it can be then used to define and to form and shape public policy. On the other hand, she's there on the stage, she's speaking to an audience, and obviously the United States has an interest to keep public opinion on side on the Ukraine war, both in the U.S. and in Europe. And so she has an interest in wearing that hat to try to talk up what the Ukrainians are doing and talk up their chances. So as we've seen over the course of this war, there obviously are these two hats that officials are wearing uncomfortably at the same time, particularly intelligence officers. So again, that's the thing we have to keep in mind. The other question I have about the basic analysis we just heard in the soundbite, one would think that the winter would not affect both sides equally, in the sense that, let's assume that the winter reduces the effectiveness of both sides to fight.
Right.
One would expect it wouldn't reduce it equally, meaning maybe it reduces the Ukrainians' effectiveness by 80% and it reduces the Russians' effectiveness by 60%. And if that's the case, one would think it would give an incentive for the Russians to move during the winter, or vice versa. Maybe it affects the Ukrainians less than it does the Russians, and therefore would give the Ukrainians an incentive to act during the winter. So I'm left with that question: why is it that each side believes that waiting to the spring would be to its advantage? And if that's the view here in early December, will that continue to be the view through January, February, and March? Or at some point in time, will one or the other side wake up and look at the situation and say, this winter is actually affecting the other side much more than it's affecting us, meaning we have an advantage to move now and not wait until March or April? So I think it's a question I'm left with from the analysis in terms of how the war will play out over the next few months. But one thing that is very clear, and again, comes as no surprise, is the time frames that everyone is looking at in this war, right? Certainly not a matter of days, as we thought in the opening of the war, or a matter of weeks or months. We're now talking to months, potentially years.
The 9th month of the war.
That's right. And we're looking at another 6-month time frame, right? Or another 3 or 4 month time frame at least. And I think implicit in what the Director of National Intelligence said is that this war is going to continue far beyond that.
Over the weekend, Schultz spoke with Putin over the phone, and Macron is now saying new security architecture should give guarantees to Russia as well. What's behind this new rhetoric, and is this a push to bring forward peace negotiations, in your opinion?
Yeah, sure. I think a lot of Western leaders are starting to think about an end game for exactly the reason that Avril Haines it mentioned, that this is a war that doesn't seem to have a real end date and doesn't seem to have a real end game, that is a kind of war of attrition. And the longer it goes on, the harder it may be, especially through the winter months. Of course, course, because of the fuel situation, the natural gas situation, particularly in Europe, to keep Western public opinion on side. And it's so essential to do that in order to provide Ukraine the support that it needs to hold Russia off. That said, of course, you mentioned in your lead exactly what Volodymyr Zelensky had to say about the price cap on Russian oil. He continues to put pressure on the West, as he has so effectively from the get-go of this war, and to try to use Ukraine's brand and their achievements on the battlefield and their achievements in their civilian resistance to try to inspire the West to stay with him. But of course, you see Western leaders a little bit nervous about their capacity to continue to deliver the goods.
Owen Alterman, thank you very much for that very thorough breakdown.